Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to review two books written by booksellers. As book lovers, I think most of us have had the dream at one point or another of running our own bookstore or even just working at a bookstore. Being around books all day, connecting people with their next potential favorite read. It sounds like an amazing job. But the realities of it are quite interesting and maybe not what you would expect. And in today's video, I would like to talk about two memoirs written by people who have either previously worked at a bookstore or currently work at a bookstore. The first book I would like to talk about was written by someone who not just worked at a bookstore, but she co-founded that bookstore. That book is called Shelf Life: Chronicles of a Cairo Bookseller by Nadia Wassef. This book was published in 2021 by FSG, which is a division of Macmillan, and my hardcover copy that I purchased with my own money comes in at 240 pages. Nadia Wassef is one of three co-founders of Dewan Bookstore in Cairo, Egypt. At the turn of the 21st century, she, her sister, and their mutual friend saw a gap in the market. At the time, there were no comfortable, modern bookstores in Egypt. So they decided to open one. And at first, no one thought it was going to be a success because at the time, books were considered a luxury in Egypt. But after the store opened its doors in 2002, it became a success. And the three of them went on to open a number of additional locations. In this book, the author describes how she and her partners envisioned the store prior to it opening. Dewan was as much of a concept as it was a bookstore. They wanted it to do and be so many things. They wanted it to be a bookstore, of course, but also to be a physical representation of the preservation of Egyptian culture, but then also a representation of Egypt's participation in a globalized world. And then in even simpler terms, they wanted it to be a place where people could come and be comfortable and spend time and enjoy the atmosphere. They wanted to do a public good by providing public restrooms to Cairo's women when those were very scarce at the time. But because the store was so high concept and really was the first of its kind, a lot of time and planning and money had to go into the layout and the interior design, getting the store set up so it could be that beautiful space that they wanted people to come and spend time in. And then came the ongoing problem of the inventory. Bookstores only have so much shelf space, so the three co-founders had to often put their heads together and think about what books they wanted to occupy that very limited space. And they would think about things like, what are the books that we're choosing saying about us as a bookstore? Who do we want to be as a bookstore? And do these books line up with that? And then the books that we choose, are those going to sell? It seems to be a very careful and constant balancing act for a bookseller, and Nadia Wassef brings us as readers into that decision-making process chapter by chapter, while she also interweaves other stories and information. Stories from her life at home, stories from her life at the store, and also pieces of Egyptian history. For instance, she talks about how books recommended by her mother, whether they be cookbooks or books on having children, books that had a history of being referenced by Egyptian women, ended up on the shelves at Dewan. We get to hear about how the author's love of Jamie Oliver's cookbooks first got her into trouble with the censors. We also get to hear about her metaphorical war with the author Paulo Coelho. Basically, throughout this book, we get to see her turning to books, seeking answers to life's questions, which I'm sure we can all relate. But the additional part, the bookseller part of that equation, is that every single time she would come across a book like that, it seems like she asked herself one additional question. It seems like she would think, this book served me. Would Dewan's customers also appreciate this? Those issues with the censors that I just mentioned represent just one of many problems that the author and her partners came up against when running this store. As a book lover, I do think it's overly easy to romanticize the idea of running a bookstore. You think it's going to be all sunshine and rainbows just being around books all day. But the realities, as portrayed in this memoir, might have the capacity to knock some of the glitter off of that perception. Everything from the slowness of orders coming in, customers refusing to accept that the store is not a library, customers stealing, employees stealing, the struggles of expansion, then the financial and ego hits of closing unsuccessful locations, disagreements and differences in management styles between the three founders. It is not a blissful afternoon in a book-filled hammock. It is running a business, especially for these three women who were blazing a new trail at the exact same time. But the author's story of building this store, this chain of stores, and making them into a success is highly impressive, as is this memoir. Throughout, the personal and the professional are basically inseparable, which when you think about it is exactly what you would expect from a memoir written by a small business owner, because the business largely does become their life. At more than one point in this memoir, the author refers to herself at the time as Mrs. Dewan. Nadia Wassef no longer works at the store. She now lives in London, although the store does continue on, which I think proves how strong of a foundation they built. But I think because she's not there anymore, because she has some distance from the day-to-day operations, some physical and emotional distance from the store, I think it was the right time for her to write this memoir. I think she can more clearly look back at her tenure there and see what all they accomplished by building this store that was so much more than a bookstore. This was such a fascinating and well-written account, and because it's juggling so many balls at once, it's so different than any other memoir I've ever read. It's just much more intellectually challenging than your typical memoir. The author is dynamic and ambitious. She brings in so many different elements into this memoir. It's a very satisfying read. So if you want to read the amazing story of this business getting off the ground plus so much more, then this one very well may be for you. But since I know this does bother some people, I will take a moment to mention that there is quite a lot of swearing in this book. That's not something that bothers me personally. I married a man from New Jersey. If you want to know why I bring that up, I would advise you to watch The Sopranos. So that doesn't bother me. But if you don't like cursing, then you may want to steer clear. If that does describe you, or if you're just looking for a second option, then you're in luck, because there is one more book by a bookseller that I wanted to talk about in today's video, and that is called Once Upon a Tome, The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller by Oliver Darkshire. This book was published in 2023 by W.W. Norton. The hardcover comes in at 256 pages. However, I read an e-copy that I purchased with my own money. This is a memoir in which the author tells stories of working in an incredibly old rare bookshop in London called Sotheran's. He chanced into a very low-paying gig as an apprentice bookseller there a number of years ago and never left. But in this book, he mainly talks about all of the surprises, the fun, and the tedium of those apprenticeship years. He begins this book by talking about finding the advertisement for this position, showing up for the interview, and then being amazed that they actually offered him this position. And then he dives into what it was like learning the ropes and discovering very quickly how much of this job wasn't actually about books, how much of it was about developing a finesse for dealing with people, whether they be customers or highly particular coworkers. He gives a short history of this bookstore, it being very old and all. There is a lot of history to tell before he fast forwards to its more modern workings. He talks about the two types of finicky collectors that keep the store afloat. He also talks about a very specific kind of customer that he calls a cryptid. These are customers that regularly slither into the bookstore but never actually buy anything. Kind of similar to Shelf Life, the book I just talked about. The author of this book talks about bookstores as a concept, but when he does it, he's mainly talking about how the public tends to view bookstores and, by extension, the people who work in them. He talks about how sometimes people can see bookshops as these sacred spaces. They want to go and be in a bookstore just because they want to be surrounded by all of those books. And then they can also sometimes see the people who work in bookshops, these booksellers, as carriers of all knowledge. They have the answers to all of life's questions, as though they're made wiser just by their proximity to all the books. But just like Shelf Life makes abundantly clear, the store is a business that needs to be concerned with sales and keeping inventory in stock, which is arguably harder at a place like Sotheran's than it is at Dewan, but for entirely different reasons. It's not like the employees of a rare bookshop can go out and order new old books. Talk about an oxymoron. Rare books are worth something. They're worth that markup because they're rare. So finding books worthy of sale takes some digging in terms of finding untapped sources, and then once you have a new source, having the eye to know what could actually sell versus what belongs in the trash. That was actually one of my favorite parts of this book, getting insight into what rare booksellers look for in the copies they acquire for the store, and then their process of cataloging those books when they bring them back to the store, a process that seems as intricate as it is nonsensical. But my number one favorite thing about this book is how funny it is. Oliver Darkshire got this book contract in the first place because a number of years ago he took over the running of the Twitter account for Sutherland's Bookshop, and his dry sense of humor turned that into a very popular account. That dry sense of humor is in each and every story in this book. It makes them so much fun. It underscores the absurdity of working in this bookshop, and I think, at least, it slightly disguises the love that I believe this author has for his job. The writing is so smart, so funny. I laughed out loud way too many times to count. I think my number one favorite thing that he says in this book, though, was when he was talking about the history of Sutherland's Bookshop. He was talking about how it moved to a quite unfashionable street in London, where apparently it remains, and he talks about that move happening with all the pomp and circumstance of a deflating balloon. Once Upon a Tome is definitely the more fun and funny of the two memoirs I've discussed today. Not that Shelf Life didn't have its fun, lightweight moments, but it is much more of a challenging, richer memoir. Both of these offer very different things, but I will say that both of them will shatter any idealistic notions you may have about working at a bookstore, which you may or may not want, but I do think that they both have the ability to replace those idealistic notions with something more realistic. Both of these were 4-star reads for me. I can definitely recommend both. They both bring something very different to the table. So maybe you want to read both, maybe you want to read just one based on how I've described them, but I can tell you that I really enjoyed both of them. But those were my thoughts on these two books that show us the inner workings of a bookshop through the eyes of someone who has worked there and knows what it's like. I would love to hear from you. Are you interested in reading either or both of these? Have you read either one? Do you have your own thoughts you want to share? I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. In the description box below, I'm going to put links to everywhere you can get your own copy of either or both of these books if you're interested. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the title of this video and that box will open up for you. And also in that description box, I'm including something I like to call the further reading section, where I will list out some book titles you may want to check out if this topic interests you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.